My sister's smile froze the moment I lifted my glass. The clinking of cutlery stopped midair. Conversations died instantly, and every head turned toward me. I could feel the weight of 100 eyes, the anticipation tightening the room like a noose. "Since my parents already promised her my apartment," I said, my voice slicing through the silence like broken glass, "let's raise a toast to the boldest lie I've ever heard in my life." The words weren't soft. They weren't wrapped. In politeness, they were sharp, deliberate, meant to cut. I watched my sister's grin falter, her eyes darting nervously to our parents, as though begging them to save her from the humiliation. My father's hand, which had been confidently resting on the back of his chair, twitched and tightened until his knuckles went white. My mother's face drained of color so quickly I almost worried she might faint. But I didn't care. They had done this. They had written this play, painted me into a corner, stood proudly in front of friends, relatives, and colleagues to announce that their generous daughter would give away her apartment to her poor younger sister, without asking. Me without warning, without even giving me the decency of a conversation. They thought I would swallow it, nod, smile, and let their lie become reality. But the second they dragged my name into their performance, I knew it was time to burn the script, flip the table, and make them choke on the story they invented for me. And I wasn't going to whisper it in private. I was going to expose them in front of every single person they had hoped to impress. They thought they had the perfect stage, a polished family portrait to parade in front of their guests. My parents had always been obsessed with appearances, the kind of people who treated reputation like oxygen. Growing up, I learned quickly that truth was optional in our house, as long as the lie was shiny enough to impress the neighbors. My father, a man who loved to puff his chest and brag about his close-knit family, would conveniently forget about the nights he screamed at us until the walls shook. My mother, who carried herself like a queen in pearls, never missed a chance to remind us that sacrifice was expected, especially from me, the eldest, the one who owed them everything for the privilege of being raised under their roof. My younger sister, however, was their jewel, their darling, the one who could do no wrong. If she stumbled, I was the cushion to catch her. If she failed, I was the excuse to cover her tracks. And tonight, at this crowded dinner they'd orchestrated, they decided to go bigger than ever. They announced to a room full of relatives and family friends that I, the dutiful daughter, was handing over my apartment to my sister as a gift. The applause was immediate, people nodding with admiration, clapping my parents on the back for raising such a selfless child. I sat there frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs, waiting for them to correct themselves, to laugh it off as a joke. But no, my father's lips curled in pride. My mother dabbed her napkin delicately as if nothing was amiss, and my sister glowed like a bride at the altar, soaking up the envy of every young cousin who wished they were in her shoes. Something snapped inside me in that moment. I felt the years of being used, dismissed, silenced, bubbling up like boiling water under a tight lid. I thought about the late nights I worked double shifts to afford that apartment, the sacrifices I made while my sister spent summers on vacations I could never join. I thought about how many times I was told to be quiet, don't ruin the mood, while they painted her as the princess and me as the servant. And suddenly, I knew I wasn't going to swallow this lie. Not tonight. Not ever again. I raised my glass not just to speak, but to shatter the illusion they had built so carefully. I wanted every person in that room to see what my family really was, a performance with me cast as the silent backdrop. This time, I refused to play along. The silence after my words stretched so long it was almost unbearable. I could see my aunt pause with a forkful of roast halfway to her mouth. My uncle's eyes widening as though he'd just witnessed a car crash in slow motion, and my cousins shifting awkwardly in their seats, glancing at each other with the kind of nervous curiosity children have when adults start to argue. My sister tried to laugh it off, her voice too high-pitched to sound convincing. "Oh, she's just being modest," she said, twirling a strand of hair the way she always did when she wanted sympathy. "She already told us she wanted me to have the place. She's just embarrassed." But her voice cracked on the last word, and I could feel the blood rushing through my veins like fire. I didn't let her lie sit. "Embarrassed?" I said, my tone cool, almost steady despite the storm inside me. "Embarrassed that my own family would stand here and announce something I never agreed to? Yes, you're right. That is embarrassing. But not for me, for you." The clink of my glass against the table as I set it down echoed louder than it should have. My father shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, his eyes warning me to stop. But I had years of his warnings stored in my memory, years of being silenced, and I wasn't going to sit down quietly this time. "Let's get one thing clear. Tonight," I continued, my voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. "I worked for that apartment. Every shift, every late night, every sacrifice, that was mine. And nobody, not even my parents, has the right to give it away as if it were theirs to offer." Gasps rippled across the table. Some people exchanged glances, others dropped their eyes to their plates, unwilling to get caught in the middle of the unfolding disaster. My mother, her face drained of its usual poise, tried to regain control. "Sweetheart," she began, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "you're overreacting. We just thought it would be nice." "Nice?" I cut in, my words sharp, enough to slice through her sentence. "Nice to strip me of the one thing I built for myself so you could parade your favorite daughter around like some spoiled queen? Nice to humiliate me in front of everyone we know so that she could play the role of the lucky younger sister? If that's what you call nice, then maybe this whole family needs a new dictionary." The air grew heavy, suffocating. But in that heaviness, I finally felt something I hadn't in years: power. For once, the room wasn't laughing at my expense, wasn't nodding along to their story. They were looking at me, hearing me, realizing that the perfect family portrait had cracks running so deep the whole frame might collapse. My sister's lips quivered as though she wanted to scream, but she couldn't form a single word. She had lived her whole life under the illusion that the world owed her everything, that her big sister would always step aside, make sacrifices, clean up messes, and smile while doing it. That night, as her carefully crafted image of the doted-upon princess began to crumble, I saw something rare flicker in her eyes. Fear. Not of me, but of what it meant if I stopped playing the part she depended on. My father finally slammed, his palm against the table, the sharp crack making several glasses rattle. "Enough!" he barked, his voice booming with the authority he wielded like a weapon all my life. "We will not air our dirty laundry in front of guests. Sit down, apologize, and stop making a scene." His words were the exact same script he'd always used, the lines meant to shrink me, to force me back into silence. But instead of flinching, I leaned forward, my voice low, steady, and far more dangerous than shouting. "No, Dad, tonight I'm not apologizing for the truth. Tonight I'm apologizing to myself for waiting this long to speak it." A hush fell over the room again. My mother tried to salvage the moment, her hand fluttering to her pearls like they could shield her from shame. "She doesn't mean it," she insisted weakly to the guests. "She's just stressed. She's tired. Don't you dare," I said, cutting her off, my tone cold enough to freeze the air between us. "Don't you dare reduce my voice to stress. You lied. You all lied. And you expected me to play along because that's the role you assigned me since I was a child. The scapegoat, the sacrifice, the one who never fights back. But tonight, I'm done being your pawn." My sister muttered, "You're ruining everything," her voice breaking, but I met her gaze with a steadiness that made her shrink back in her chair. "No," I replied softly but firmly. "I'm saving myself. If this family crumbles because I refuse to be exploited, then it was never strong to begin with. The weight of those words pressed down on everyone. Guests who once clapped in admiration for my generosity now stared with wide eyes, realizing the truth behind the facade. I could see some of them shifting uncomfortably, understanding they had been complicit, clapping for a theft dressed up as a gift. And for the first time in years, I felt taller than my father, stronger than my mother, and freer than my sister had ever been. My father's face flushed crimson, a vein in his temple pulsing as if he might explode. But for the first time in my life, his anger didn't frighten me. I had endured it too long. His booming voice, his slammed doors, his threats disguised as lessons. Tonight, that intimidation had no power left. "You think you can embarrass me like this?" he hissed, leaning across the table. "You'll regret it." But instead of shrinking back, I held his stare, calm, unwavering, as if his rage were nothing more than smoke dissipating in the air. "The only thing I regret," I said slowly, "is giving you so many years of my silence." Gasps scattered, again, like sparks from a fire. My mother grabbed his arm, whispering harshly, "Stop, you're making it worse." But her hands trembled so badly the guests could see her mask slipping. My sister, her eyes brimming with tears, tried again, to salvage the night. "You promised," she whimpered, like a child clutching a broken toy. "You said I would get it." The words, so entitled, so blind to reality, made my blood run hot. "No," I said firmly, my voice slicing through her fantasy. They promised you my life, my work, my home, because that's what they always promised you. Everything of mine. But that ends tonight." I could feel the collective discomfort thickening in the air, but behind it, there was something else. Respect. A few guests, ones who had seen glimpses of the truth over the years but never dared speak it, now nodded almost imperceptibly. I wasn't just defending myself. I was pulling back the curtain on a lie that had reigned for decades. My father opened his mouth again, but before he could launch into another tirade, I stood, my chair scraping back across the floor, the sound sharp as a blade. "This toast," I said, raising my glass high once more, "isn't for my sister. It isn't for my parents. It's for the end of a story where I was forced to play the villain so they could look like saints. Tonight I reclaim the pen. Tonight, I write my own ending." The glass touched my lips, and I drank slowly, deliberately, the silence in the room deafening. My parents sat frozen, pale and exposed, their empire of appearances crumbling before everyone who once applauded them. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like their daughter. I felt like my own person. And nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever tasted as sweet. When I set my glass down again, I felt the weight of the entire room pressing in, but this time it wasn't crushing me, it was lifting me. The guests who had walked through my parents' front door expecting another evening of staged perfection now sat frozen in the reality I had laid bare. I could see the shame flickering across my mother's eyes, her hands fidgeting with her napkin as though she could fold the truth away. My father leaned back in his chair, his jaw locked so tightly it looked like stone. But I knew that behind that hardened mask was panic. He thrived on control, and in one speech I had stolen it from him. My sister, mascara streaking down her cheeks, kept muttering under her breath, "This isn't fair. This isn't fair." As though fairness had ever been something she'd given a thought to when everything was handed to her. I let the silence linger, stretching until it became unbearable for them. Then I looked directly at my father and said, "You always taught me that family is about loyalty, but what you really meant was obedience. Tonight I choose loyalty to myself, and I will never again obey lies dressed as love." My words didn't echo with anger, but with something stronger. Finality. My aunt cleared her throat nervously, trying to break the tension, but even she couldn't disguise the fact that the facade had shattered. People avoided my parents' eyes, some whispering quietly, some simply staring at their plates, as if afraid to get dragged into the wreckage. My father finally tried to salvage what little pride he thought he had left. "We'll discuss this later," he muttered through clenched teeth, but I shook my head, my voice clear, unwavering. "No, there is nothing left to discuss. Not later. Not ever. This conversation ends here, and so does your control over me." My chest rose with steady breath, not shaky fear, and for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't trembling. I wasn't small. I wasn't powerless. I turned toward the guests, forcing myself to look each of them in the eye. "Now you know the truth. Believe whatever you want about me, but at least know this: I will never let anyone else speak for me again." With that, I placed my glass down one final time and stood tall, the kind of tall that comes not from height, but from freedom. The dining room, once filled with false laughter and rehearsed smiles, now felt like the stage of my liberation. I pushed my chair fully back, and the sound it made against the hardwood floor sliced the silence like a warning bell. My mother gasped, quietly, whispering my name as if calling me back into the role she had always scripted for me. But I didn't stop. I stood, shoulders squared, heart steady, and in that moment, I knew the chains of this family had finally broken. My father's hand twitched as though he wanted to grab my arm, pull me down, and force me to apologize in front of everyone, but I stepped out of his reach. "Don't," I said firmly, not loud, but commanding enough that even he froze. The "I" word hung in the air like a final strike of a gavel. My sister's tears had turned to anger, her voice shrill as she hissed, "You're humiliating us in front of everyone." I turned slowly to face her, my expression calm in contrast to her. Hysteria. "No," I replied, every syllable deliberate. "I'm exposing you. You can't be humiliated by the truth, only revealed." She shrank back as murmurs rippled down the table, relatives exchanging looks, some shocked, some almost relieved, like they had been waiting for years for someone to finally say out loud what they suspected. I could feel the walls of that dining room, so often a prison for me, transforming into something else, a witness box where their lies were finally on trial. My father growled under his breath, "You'll regret this when you need us." For a second, I almost laughed. The idea that I needed them after everything was absurd. "Need you?" I repeated, tilting my head. What I needed was respect. What I needed was honesty. What I needed was a family, not an audience. And since you couldn't give me that, I'll make my own. My chest no longer carried the weight of fear. It carried lightness, the kind that only comes after telling the truth you've buried too long. Around the table, some guests shifted uncomfortably, others raised their eyebrows as though silently, applauding me, but no one dared to speak. I didn't wait for my parents' response, because there was nothing left for them to say that could matter. I had burned the script, shattered the mask, and set myself free in one single night. And as I turned toward the door, the room seemed smaller than it ever had before, because for the first time I was bigger than it. I walked toward the doorway slowly, not rushing, letting each step echo across the marble floor as though I were stamping the truth deeper into the house that had once suffocated me. My mother's voice trailed behind me, trembling. "Please, don't leave like this. People are watching." But that was exactly the point. People were watching, and they were finally seeing them for who they really were. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the frame, and glanced back just once. Their faces were unforgettable, my father rigid and pale, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might shatter. My mother wilted in her chair, clutching at her pearls like they could hold her together. And my sister, makeup smeared, glaring at me with the kind of hatred only entitlement breeds. "For years," I said clearly, my voice carrying over the hush of the stunned guests, "you taught me that silence was respect. Tonight I learned that silence was just consent to my own erasure. Never again." A ripple of whispers moved across the room, but I didn't wait for reactions. I turned and walked down the hallway, each step away from that dining room feeling like a step back into my own life. My heels clicked against the polished floorboards, a sound that once felt like an intrusion in this house, but now rang like a declaration. Behind me, the noise of the dinner resumed in fragmented bursts, my father trying to salvage authority, my mother trying to excuse the chaos, my sister crying louder, insisting she was the victim. Let them. Let them spin whatever story they wanted, because I had taken away the one thing they couldn't rewrite, the truth spoken in front of witnesses. When I opened the front door, the cool night air rushed over me, and for the first time, in years, I felt like I could breathe without restraint. The muffled clamor of voices behind me grew faint as the door closed, sealing them in with their lies, while I stepped out into the open darkness that suddenly felt brighter than any room I had ever been trapped in. I walked down the front steps slowly, feeling the crisp air against my skin, the kind of air that carried both chill and clarity. For years I had dreaded family gatherings, the rehearsed smiles, the whispered criticisms, the way my parents used me as a prop to showcase their perfect family. But tonight, something had shifted. The house behind me, lit up with chandeliers and filled with murmurs of gossip and shock, was no longer my prison. It was their stage collapsing on top of them. I could almost imagine the scene continuing. After my exit, my father snapping at guests to mind their own business, my mother trying desperately to spin excuses, my sister sobbing dramatically, clinging to whoever would comfort her. But none of it mattered anymore, because I wasn't part of that script. I thought of all the nights I lay awake in my apartment, exhausted from double shifts, wondering if they'd ever see me as more than a resource to drain, a scapegoat to shame, a background character in their performance. And then I realized they never would, but I didn't need them to. I owned my apartment. I owned my choices. And most importantly, I owned my voice, the one they had tried to bury under guilt and manipulation. I kept walking, the sound of my footsteps grounding me, every step a reminder that I had finally chosen myself. By the time I reached the street, I pulled out my phone and saw it lighting up already. Messages from cousins, an aunt, even a family friend. Some texts were hesitant, others bold, but the theme was the same. We're proud of you. We saw everything. Don't let them twist this. My throat tightened, not with regret, but with a strange, powerful relief. For so long, I thought speaking up would make me alone, abandoned. Instead, the moment I told the truth, I wasn't alone at all. Their kingdom of lies was crumbling, and I was walking freely outside of it, into a future that finally belonged to me. The streetlights glowed faintly as I walked, each pool of light catching the shimmer of my dress, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was running away from anything. I was walking toward myself. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from my aunt, the one who always sat quietly at family dinners, who never contradicted my parents but whose eyes often softened in my direction when things got cruel. Her words were short, but carried. Wait. You were right to do it. Don't let them guilt you. I'll explain to anyone who asks. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with gratitude. Even the smallest confirmation, the smallest flicker of support, felt like sunlight breaking through clouds after years of storms. I stopped under one of the lights and looked back at the house from a distance. Through the curtains, I could see silhouettes moving frantically, hands waving, voices raised. It was chaos in there now, but it wasn't mine to manage anymore. They would scramble to rebuild their image, to twist the story into something they could survive with. But the truth had already been spoken, and no amount of lies could erase the moment their guests saw their masks slip. I turned away and started walking again, each step steadier than the last. My mind replayed my father's words. "You'll regret this when you need us." And I almost laughed aloud at the absurdity. Need them? What did I need from people who saw me as disposable? I had survived on my own for years, paid my own bills, built my own home, carved out my independence without their help. If anything, they had been a weight I dragged along. Now, without them clinging to me, I felt lighter, stronger. My sister's face flashed in my memory, streaked with mascara and entitlement, and I realized she would never understand why I did what I did. She wasn't built to understand sacrifice or boundaries. But that wasn't my responsibility anymore. Let her rage, let her cry, let her play the victim. Because the only role I would ever play again was the author of my own life. I inhaled the night air deeply, the coolness filling my lungs like freedom itself, and I knew there was no going back. By the time I reached the corner, I slowed my steps, letting the quiet of the neighborhood wrap around me. The laughter and clinking glasses that had once defined my family's gatherings were gone, replaced by a suffocating hush behind those walls. I imagined my parents scrambling now, their perfect facade cracked beyond repair, their guests whispering as they slipped on coats and made polite excuses to leave early. The story they had so carefully scripted for years had collapsed in one night, all because I refused to be silent. And it wasn't rage that carried me anymore. It was clarity. I thought back to my childhood, the endless comparisons, the way my sister was praised for the smallest effort while my accomplishments were dismissed as obligations. I remembered being told to let her win at board games because she's younger, being ordered to give her my clothes, my time, even my peace, all under the guise of being a good sister. It never stopped. It only grew bigger as we aged, morphing from toys to money, from time to my very home. And tonight, they tried to hand her the biggest piece of me yet, the apartment that had been my salvation, my proof that I could survive. Without them. That was their mistake. That was the line they couldn't force me to cross. My phone buzzed again, another message. This time from an old family friend who had been at the dinner. "I always wondered how they treated you. Tonight I saw it clearly. You were brave." I smiled faintly, a smile that wasn't for show, not the polite one I had worn at 100 family events. This one was real. For years I thought speaking out would isolate me, but what I felt instead was connection to people who saw me, who heard me, who respected me without conditions. My father's threats, my mother's manipulations, my sister's entitlement, they no longer felt like chains. They were just noise fading behind me as I walked forward. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't breaking my family apart. I was breaking free from a cage they built around me. And with every step into the cool night air, I felt the strength of a woman who had finally chosen herself over the lies that once defined her. I reached the end of the block and stopped beneath a tall oak tree, its branches swaying softly in the night breeze. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket, a sharp contrast to the chaos I had left behind. My hands were steady now, no trembling, no racing heartbeat, just a deep calm I hadn't known in years. I leaned against the cool bark and let the memories roll over me, all the moments that led here. I thought about the day I signed the lease for my apartment, the way my chest swelled with pride knowing I had built something without their help. I remembered painting the walls myself, scrubbing the floors late into the night, every blister on my hands a badge of independence. That space wasn't just bricks and furniture. It was proof that I could exist outside their shadow. And tonight, when they tried to strip it away in front of everyone, they underestimated me. They thought I was still the girl who stayed quiet, who swallowed her anger for the sake of family peace. They didn't see that I had been quietly gathering strength all along. My sister's stunned face replayed in my mind. Her world cracked. Open, her entitlement confronted with reality for the first time. She had no idea who I truly was without the leash my parents kept on me. Neither did they. And now they were about to find out. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a coworker who'd been invited to the dinner through some extended connection. "You're stronger than anyone in that house. Don't doubt yourself." I exhaled slowly, my lips curling into a real smile. The truth was, I didn't doubt myself anymore. Not after tonight. I had stood up in front of everyone who mattered to them and shattered the illusion they valued more than love. That was the ultimate betrayal in their eyes. But for me, it was the ultimate freedom. I pushed away from the tree, straightened my shoulders, and began walking again. Every step away from that house felt like reclaiming years of stolen pieces of myself. I wasn't just leaving a dinner. I was leaving a lifetime of silence, and I knew with absolute certainty I would never go back. The further I walked, the lighter I felt, as though the years of carrying my family's expectations on my back had finally fallen away and dissolved into the night air. The house was far behind me now, its lights glowing faintly like a stage. In the distance, a place where actors still scrambled to hold together a play whose audience no longer believed. I pulled my coat tighter around me, not from cold, but from the strange comfort of knowing I could finally protect myself, on my terms. My mind replayed the moment I raised that glass, how my voice cut through the room, how their faces drained of color. That image would stay with me forever, not as a memory of cruelty, but as a reminder of strength. For once, I hadn't whispered, I hadn't excused, I hadn't let them twist my words into something palatable. I had spoken, clearly, undeniably, and they couldn't erase it. My phone lit up once more, and this time it was from one of my cousins. "You don't know how long I've wanted to say something too. Thank you for being brave enough." My throat tightened, my eyes burning with something I hadn't expected, relief. For years I had believed I was the only one suffocating, the only one trapped under their control. But maybe I wasn't. Maybe others had been watching from the sidelines, too afraid to step in, too conditioned to play along. And maybe tonight, my words had cracked more than just my own cage. I paused under another street lamp, the glow casting my shadow long against the pavement. For the first time, I didn't see that shadow as small or weak. I saw it stretching far, wide, unafraid. I thought of my father's threat, "You'll regret this when you need us," and realized how hollow it was. I didn't need them. I never had. What I needed was myself, my strength, my truth. And tonight, in front of everyone they wanted to impress, I had found it. I turned my gaze toward the darkened streets ahead, endless and open, and smiled. The story of my family's lies ended in that dining room, but mine was only beginning. As I walked further, the night felt alive around me, every sound sharper, every breath deeper, as if the world itself was reminding me I was free. I thought about how many years I had sat at their table, biting my tongue while my parents spun stories about our perfect family. I remembered the way they boasted about my sacrifices as though they were trophies on their shelf, while my own dreams were pushed aside so my sister could shine. And yet here I was, finally untangled from that web. The apartment key in my purse felt heavier than gold. It wasn't just metal. It was my shield, my anchor, the proof that no matter what they claimed, I had built something for myself. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was from one of the older family friends, a man who had known my parents for decades. His message was blunt. "I always knew they favored your sister, but I didn't realize how far it went. You did the right thing. Don't ever question it." Reading those words, I felt something shift permanently inside me. For years I had believed speaking up would only isolate me, that I'd be the villain in every story. But now, as messages poured, in one after another, some shocked, some supportive, I realized the opposite was true. The lie had isolated me. The truth was setting me free. Behind me, my parents would rage, my sister would sob, and excuses would fly like broken glass, cutting anyone who dared to get too close. But none of it was mine to carry anymore. That was their chaos, their undoing. My silence had been their greatest weapon, but my voice tonight had become my revenge. I stopped at the corner cafe, closed for the night, its windows dark and quiet, and stared at my reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time, I didn't see the obedient daughter, the scapegoat, the background to someone else's story. I saw a woman who had chosen herself, who had walked through fire and refused to burn. I whispered softly to that reflection, words meant only for me. Never again. Then I straightened, turned, and walked on, each step carrying me further away from the ruins of their lies and closer to the life that was finally, completely mine. By the time I reached my apartment, the city was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels sacred. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking on the light. The familiar warmth of the place wrapped around me like a promise. Every corner of this apartment held pieces of me. The couch I had saved up for, the chipped mug from nights of late study, the photos I chose, the colors I painted with my own hands. None of it had been handed down, none of it stolen from someone else's effort. This space was my sanctuary, my rebellion, my truth carved into brick and plaster. I set my purse down on the counter and leaned against it, closing my eyes. For the first time in years, there was no ringing in my ears from my father's shouting, no hollow echo of my mother's guilt trips, no shrill demands from my sister, just silence, real silence. It wasn't the silence of being silenced. It was the silence of peace. My phone buzzed once more. Another message, this time from my cousin's wife, a woman who had often given me sympathetic glances across the table. You showed them. We've all seen it for years, but tonight you said it out loud. Don't feel alone. You aren't. My chest tightened, not with fear or grief, but with an overwhelming release. For so long, I thought I had no allies, that my parents had woven their net so tightly that everyone believed them. But the truth had cracked that net wide open, and people were slipping through. Maybe they wouldn't confront my parents the way I had, but they saw me. And that mattered. I poured myself a glass of water and sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the night settling in. The apartment hummed with stillness, and I realized how precious this home truly was. It wasn't just walls and furniture. It was my declaration that I existed outside their grip. They could lie, they could spin, they could cry and rage, but they could never take this from me. And no matter what storm came tomorrow, tonight I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had broken their hold forever. The night stretched on, and though exhaustion tugged at my body, my mind felt sharper than it ever had. I sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street below, and replayed every moment of the evening in my head. The smug way my father had announced the gift, my mother's satisfied smile as though generosity flowed from her hands, my sister's glowing pride as she basked in attention that was never hers to earn. They believed they had cornered me, that my silence would seal the performance. But I hadn't just refused to play along, I had destroyed the stage. I thought of their faces when I spoke, the shock, the pale fury, the collapse of control that had been their weapon for decades. That memory would sustain me for years. It wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about justice, about finally placing a mirror in front of them so they could see the ugliness they had dressed up. As family honor? For so long they told me I was ungrateful whenever I resisted, that I was selfish whenever I said no, that I was cold whenever I dared to protect myself. Tonight, I stripped those words from their mouths and gave them back. I felt something, bloom inside me, something that had been buried under years of guilt and fear. Pride. Not the hollow pride my father carried, swollen with lies, but the quiet, unshakable pride of someone who finally stood up straight after being bent for too long. The apartment, my work, my independence, my voice, all of it was mine. And nothing they did could change that. I imagined the fallout that would come in the days ahead. The angry phone calls, the guilt-drenched messages, maybe even threats of being cut off from the family, as if I hadn't already been living without their support. I pictured my sister sulking, furious that the world didn't bend for her the way my parents had always bent me. And I pictured my parents spinning their story, telling anyone who would listen that I was unstable, dramatic, ungrateful. Let them. The truth had been spoken in front of witnesses, and no amount of spin could erase the way the room froze when I raised my glass and exposed their lie. That moment was carved into memory, unchangeable. I leaned my head back against the wall, the city's hum drifting faintly through the window, and let the relief wash over me. This wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. For the first time. I wasn't afraid of their wrath, their judgment, or their absence. I wasn't afraid of being alone because I finally had myself. And in that stillness, I knew. The silence they once demanded from me had transformed into something else. Entirely. It had become my strength, my weapon, and my freedom. Tonight, I had broken the cycle, and there was no turning back. Morning came slowly, light spilling through the blinds of my apartment, painting the walls in soft gold. I hadn't slept much, but it didn't matter. What I felt wasn't exhaustion. It was liberation. My phone, still buzzing occasionally, with unread messages, lay face down on the table. I didn't need to look. I already knew what waited there. Apologies wrapped in manipulation, pleas disguised as concern, and from others, quiet words of support. But the truth was, I no longer needed any of it. The validation I sought for years didn't matter anymore. Last night, for the first time, I validated myself. I brewed coffee in my chipped mug, the one I bought the same week I signed my lease, and took a slow sip, savoring the bitter warmth. It tasted like independence. It tasted like peace. As I looked around my apartment, I realized how symbolic every little thing here was. The couch I saved up for, the photographs of places I visited on my own, the books stacked by the window. These weren't just possessions. They were proof that I had survived. Proof that I had built a life that didn't belong to my parents, my sister, or anyone else. My father's threat, "You'll regret this when you need us," echoed faintly in my memory. But instead of fear, it made me smile. I didn't regret a thing. What I regretted was waiting this long to stand up. What I regretted was letting them believe they had the right to decide my future. But even that regret was dissolving now, replaced by a stronger certainty. They would never control me again. My mother's face, pale and desperate under the chandelier, flickered in my thoughts. My sister's tear-streaked anger, my father's clenched jaw. I knew they'd spend days, maybe weeks, trying to rebuild their image, trying to spin the story, trying to cast me as the villain in their script. Let them. Villain or hero, I no longer cared how they painted me. Because the truth was, I had stepped out of their story entirely. I wasn't their character anymore. I was the author of my own life. I carried my coffee to the window and looked out at the street. Alive now with people heading to work, buses humming, the city awake. I felt awake, too, in a way I never had before. Last night I had lifted a glass and spoken words they never expected to hear, words that cut through decades of silence, and though their faces turned pale, mine lit up with something they could never steal from me again. Freedom. My story didn't end at that dinner table. It began there. And as the city moved beneath me, I whispered softly to myself the truth I had waited a lifetime to learn. Family isn't who claims you, it's who respects you. And when neither exists, you build it for yourself? That was my revenge. That was my peace. And it was only the beginning.